There are few times in my automotive career that I have been more stressed than I am right now. I have been killing myself to get this car ready to go on track so we can drive it in the next episode, whether it works or not. That's going to happen. But to make matters more stressful, I found out 3 days ago that our ship date to send this car to Australia has been moved up to June 21st. I literally have 1 month to get this car ready to compete on a track on the other side of the planet. I've got my work cut out for me, but I feel pretty good about it. Let's keep the pedal down. I have been killing it for the last week, so let's dive into the biggest episode yet. In the last episode, we spent the entire week with Riley at RS Motorsport fitting and installing a roll cage that is, without question, the best it could possibly be. But on the note of safety, we've got a bit more safety equipment we need to get installed in this car so that it is ready for competition. First on the list is a Lifeline fire suppression system, and I've opted for a 2.25 kilogram Novec 1230 extinguishant, which, believe it or not, is a real word. We're limited on space inside of the car, but thankfully there's just enough room behind the kick plate we installed at the base of the passenger footwell. The kick plate can be removed for scrutineering, and the gauge itself will sit proud at the top so we can keep an eye on it at any point. There are a lot of ways to actuate a system like this, but I have opted for old-fashioned pull cables. I'm a fan of this over worrying about whether or not the electronics will work when I really need it. This system also utilizes 5 individual extinguisher nozzles, 3 for the engine bay and 2 for inside of the car with me. The golden nozzles for the engine bay produce a 160-degree fan, while the blue ones for inside of the car are reduced to 120 for focus on the driver and passenger. Getting all of these parts installed will require some custom bracketry, so a few weeks ago I sent an order out to SendCutSend, and now we're ready to dive in. First up is a bracket so we can mount a pull cable to the outside of the car. Our fire system comes with 2, one for inside and one for outside in case of the worst, as is required by most motorsport rule sets. I spent a while trying to decide where to mount the exterior pull cable, but after realizing there was nowhere both good and safe to do it at the front, I've decided to mount it at the very back of the car. I used a DIY plumb bob to get it lined up between the passenger taillights, because if I'm going to mount this thing so it's obviously visible, I at least want it to be centered and to look good. With the mount bolted into place, it's time to run the cable up to the extinguisher bottle itself. I decided to get a little bit crafty on how to pull this installation off. The Ferrari was originally equipped with a cable-operated e-brake, which means there are tubes that run from inside the car to the back of the car through which the original cable passed. The pull cable for the fire extinguisher system and its sheathing fit inside of these tubes, so I passed them up and to the front of the car through the tube work, making for a protected and stealth installation. Affixing the cable to the tank itself just requires a set screw, and so with that, one of the cables is done. The installation at the back of the car looks pretty decent. It's race car-esque. I probably prefer it without it, but as a whole, I think it works, and it's a reminder of just how far down the race car path we've gone. To ice the cake, I've got our extinguisher decal applied, even though we're going to be rewrapping the car before it heads off to Australia. Now, up next should be installing the interior pull cable, but in order to do that, we're going to need a complicated mount that it will share with the shift lever for our Swaybar. So we'll pause here because in order to install that, we need to install the Swaybar first. But to install the Swaybar, we need to get the car up in the air, and to get the car up in the air, we need to redo the shelving behind it. Now, I'll agree that building shelving doesn't sound like a crucial step in finishing the Ferrari, but look at the size of the crate this stuff showed up in. It's completely blocking the door, and I want to move the Audi and put the Ferrari in its place, so we've got to get stuff assembled and moved around. Die-hard fans of the channel might be familiar with the messy shelves that have been behind the Audi for the last 10 years I've been in this shop. As fans of the channel, the team at Levrack said, hey, we've got a solution for that. They were then kind enough to send over one of their 12-foot Levrack systems, and thus the afternoon spent assembling the thing was time very well spent. The Levrack system completely transformed this corner of the shop, both aesthetically and organizationally. For once, everything over here is organized and I know where it all is, and stuff isn't spilling off the shelves in between takes behind my car. If you aren't familiar with this system, the units slide back and forth to reveal shelves hidden between them, and this means I've got significantly more storage space than I had in this same footprint before. I've only filled up about half of these Levrack shelves versus the absolute stuffed full shelves that I had before. So a special thank you to Levrack for supporting the channel and for the shop space and making it that much better. But with the shelving install complete, now we can move the Audi and put the Ferrari in its place, get it up on jack stands, and start sorting out our suspension. Given the fact that we redesigned our own uprights and control arms, the factory sway bars are no longer configured to work properly. And even if they were, there are no good 308 sway bar upgrades available on the market. So as with everything else in this car, we're going custom, and I've sourced this double-bladed adjustable sway bar. But it's not any ordinary adjustable sway bar. This one can be adjusted from inside the car while driving. Now, I first learned about sway bars like this from the 80s E30 DTM race cars. These cars were equipped with driver adjustable sway bars using levers that were within the driver's reach, both for the front and rear of the car. It's kind of tough to find photos of these sway bars on the cars, but if we look at some in-car video of one in action, and we zoom in right by the driver's right knee, you'll see one of these quote-unquote shift levers right within his reach. By pushing or pulling on this shift lever, he's able to operate a push-pull cable and rotate the blades of the sway bar to increase or decrease its stiffness. With the blade of the sway bar turned vertically like you see here, this has the sway bar at its stiffest, because the sway bar end must flex on its thickest axis. But by rotating the sway bar blade, we are now asking it to flex on a thinner axis. It becomes easier to do and thus less stiff. Now, to find a sway bar that fit the Ferrari, I took a bunch of measurements only to realize that it's incredibly close to a Porsche 997. So that's what this bar is out of. And believe it or not, if you combine a Porsche 997 front sway bar with mounts out of a 2015 Camaro, it becomes a bolt-on affair. The ends of this sway bar are splined, as are most race applications, so I made marks and indexed everything before I took it apart. I removed the Delrin bushings from the Porsche bar, and then swapped poly bushings and mounts on from the Chevrolet, and reassembled so I could fit it to the car. It will be installed exactly where the original Ferrari sway bar sat. In our case, it's directly behind and underneath the radiator. For what it's worth, I think with some crafty end links this would work on any 308, but in our case, it's a perfect fit. We can install the Camaro mounts and they bolt to the original bolt-in provisions of the Ferrari chassis. With the other arm installed and everything bolted down, the sway bar is officially fitted to the car, and now we just need an end link solution to attach it to the control arm. We're working within very limited space, and so the end link is going to be short. I'm just going to use a male and female rod end as an end link solution. Simple, if not overkill. So my initial plan for this was to take an end link and attach it to the sway bar and then figure out how to attach it to the upper control arm. There's no room on the bottom, and I figured this would be a nice, simple approach. And by drilling one hole and using one bolt, if we drill a hole in the top of this, I'd be able to just bolt this to the upper control arm and then bolt this to the rod end, if I can put it together with one hand, just like that. And with a single hole and a single bolt, I'd have a complete sway bar setup. But I realized there's one problem after having Brett machine these out, and that's that this is a compressive ball joint, and putting a sway bar on the upper control arm would put this in tension. It would be trying to pull the ball joint apart. Some ball joints are meant for that, but this one is not, and I don't want it to fail. So this idea, nice and simple, although heavy, is back to the drawing board. We got to figure something else out. Unfortunately, any solution we come up with is going to require some welding, and some of you may remember that in the last episode, my torch took a dump and sprung a leak. So we'll need to replace it before we can stick metal to metal. I went out and bought another CK Worldwide Flex Head TIG torch because I'm in love with the way that it works, and I genuinely think that having the ability to flex the TIG torch head has made my welds better. At least, it's given me better positioning overall. Unwrapping and rewrapping 25 feet of TIG torch lead cover is probably the worst part of the job, but with that done, we're ready to get back to it. I fought tooth and nail not to have to pull the suspension apart, but ultimately I decided the best solution was to modify the lower control arm and to give it a pickup point for the sway bar so that everything would play nicely together. For better or worse, because I've built so many control arms at this point, I also have a drawer full of tabs to make them. Luckily, I have some tabs that are perfectly suited towards being a Swaybar pickup point, and they fit the control arm with zero modification, so I'm going to make this change permanent and weld them on. With the control arms reinstalled and the end links fitted, we can cross the Swaybar itself off of the list, but now we've got to talk about how the adjustment works. What I have here is the push-pull adjustment lever. It attaches to a cable and operates the blade on the end of the Swaybar by rotating it. Pushing it forwards or backwards will rotate it in the respective direction, but it requires a bit of force to operate, so it's going to need a sturdy mount inside of the car. I've decided I want this thing mounted right next to the transmission shifter, mostly because I'll know where it is mentally and to keep the interior from becoming cluttered. I fired up Fusion 360 and I drew this simple sheet metal mount, or at least it looks simple, but it was perhaps one of the most complicated things I've drawn so far, believe it or not. I used bends on different axes to orient the shift lever correctly inside of the car despite the angled mount surface. This should be strong enough to push and pull the cable that will in turn turn the bladed sway bar. The only catch is, I'm going to need that mount from Send Cut Send before we can actually order a cable that will fit the car correctly so we can cross the sway bar as a whole off the list. Now let's turn our attention to the dashboard. We had to remove it to install the roll cage, and now it doesn't fit back into place. It can't go in from the front due to the angle of the A-pillars and the increased width of the roll bar itself, and it can't fit in from the front even with the windshield removed. Notching it doesn't alleviate the problem, so we'd have to lop both ends off, and I'm not really happy with that solution. But even if I was, because we moved the steering column, the binnacle that holds the dash wouldn't be centered, so ultimately, we're going to have to build a new dash panel from scratch that mimics the shape of the original. Clearly though, that's a huge project to undertake, and we don't have the time for it, so let's try something different. Some of you may remember the Ender 3 3D printer that I bought almost a year ago. I got the whole thing put together, but ran into a number of problems that, over the course of the last year, no one has been able to solve, and so it's sat collecting dust this entire time. But if you're thinking what I'm thinking, no, we're not going to 3D print an entire dashboard. But I did buy a Bambu Labs X1C carbon 3D printer after everyone on the StanceWorks Discord insisted this was the machine to get. It seems to be the buzz of the 3D printing world right now, and as someone who wants a 3D printing experience that requires no setup, no headache, no hassle, and just the simple click of a button, I was promised this was where to get it. Now, because I like diving into the deep end head first, I fired up Fusion 360 and drew up a mount for our Haltech IC7 digital dash. I then asked the 3D printer to make it a reality and printed it using carbon fiber reinforced nylon. What you see here are the first prints from my machine with no setup and no experience whatsoever, and to say that I'm impressed is a massive understatement. I included provisions for embedded hardware so that the nuts and bolts would be captive, and I printed it at a 100% infill, which made for a part so strong I am unable to break it by hand. I then printed a backing plate for the dash itself, yielding a mount that can clamp to the tube work inside of the car so we can forego a traditional dash for the time being. And then for a finishing touch, I printed a visor for the system. And if this doesn't showcase what this printer is capable of in completely inexperienced hands, I don't know what will. The finish quality and the strength of these parts is absolutely incredible, and I can already tell I'm going to be using the hell out of this machine. Now, I'll be curious to see how these 3D printed parts work out in the long run, but my initial assessment is that they are incredible. The pieces fit together like machined parts with proper tolerances, and they look like it too. I've always been hesitant to incorporate 3D printing into my workflow because I've never felt like these machines could deliver parts I'd be happy with, but here we are. Some of you may remember in one of the previous episodes we mounted a pair of kill switches to the car, one on the cowl and one inside. The one mounted to the cowl had a nice, easy-to-solve home. I simply put it in one of the original wiper mounting holes. But inside the car, I kind of mocked it up and said I'd need to come up with a solution, and thus, as always, I turned to Fusion 360 and Send Cut Send and wound up with this bracket we're going to mount to the underside of the original dash panel. Because I'll be torquing on the key and because I want to mount some other stuff to this, I want to weld up a reinforcement to each side of it. so I heated up the material to get some good penetration without having the weld run away from me, and made it all one piece. One of the design constraints I had to consider while designing this mount was that I needed to be able to reach it while strapped in to the seat, which is why it protrudes so far from the dash bar itself. But because it protrudes, we do have a nice surface on top of it with which we can mount something, and it's here that I'd like to mount my AIM Solo 2. Because I'll be moving the AIM Solo from car to car, I want to use a standard RAM mount. If you aren't familiar with what an AIM Solo is, it is an onboard lap timer that also records telemetry while you're racing. It can wirelessly download your lap information to the computer once you're done with a session and give you immediate feedback about where you're losing time and where you're gaining it. It's one of the gold standards of lap timing, so we're going to run it in conjunction with our Haltech systems. With the Solo and our dash mounted in the car, things are starting to feel way more complete, if not way more sparse than they used to. I'm really happy with the 3D printed mounts for the IC7, and this stuff will work as a great stopgap while I think about how to build a complete dashboard, whether that's before Australia or after. But hold on a second. If I have a 3D printer, but we were waiting on a bracket from SendCutSend to finish our fire system installation, what if we just 3D print that bracket as a mock-up so we can install both the shifter and the fire system pull cables? So that's exactly what I did. This one's just a quick and dirty PLA print, but even still, the quality's impressive, and better yet, it does a perfect job of illustrating that our Swaybar adjuster will clear whether we're swinging it forwards or backwards. Mocked up in the car, it's looking exactly as intended. It clears the base of the transmission shifter perfectly, and once I reroute our power cables to the other side of the shifter as they were originally, everything should clear without error. I'll need to order up the correct cable length, and hopefully we can have that finished up for the next episode. As far as the fire extinguisher pull cable goes, our bracket bolts to the top of it, and this allows me to cut the cable to length and install it to the fire bottle for final installation once we have the finished bracket. If we want to finish out our fire system installation, we need to install the nozzles. It's important that these nozzles are held up by brackets and not just the hosing itself that supplies them with extinguishing. Thankfully, my buddy John was willing to help out and fabbed up some brackets while I was working on other projects, allowing me to return to this one and get it wrapped up quickly. As mentioned previously, both blue nozzles are mounted in the cabin, both under the dash pointed towards the driver. I've got the yellow nozzles mounted in the engine bay, and I'm just waiting on a bit more hose so I can finish the plumbing. On the notion of fire safety, I've also decided I'm going to install an element fire extinguisher in the event there's a fire that doesn't warrant pulling the cable on the Novex system. An element extinguisher isn't going to stop a fire if something like my fuel cell ruptures, but it can handle fires at scale. It's perfect for use in a confined space like inside of a car or in an engine bay, in the event I want to stop the car from burning to a crisp without having to go full tilt and pull the fire extinguisher system. I've had friends with cars burned to the ground, and I've had my own garage burned to the ground, so I'll take every bit of help I can get. I've got it mounted where I can easily access it from the driver's seat, or anybody coming up to the car can grab it too. Lastly, it's in the perfect spot to grab if I'm exiting the car in the event of a big fire and still have some flames on me to extinguish. Now let's shift gears entirely and start on a new project. Some of you may remember at the beginning of the build that we ran our coolant lines through the car's rocker panels, as opposed to through the middle of the car where they were originally placed from the factory. The reason for this is that the middle of the car is occupied by the water lines for the intercooler system, and the rockers are bigger and allow us to run -20 lines through them. But during my time at RS Motorsport, I explained that we had to remove the coolant lines from the rocker panels, as the plates that we welded in for the cage to attach to prohibit the lines from passing through the rockers at this point. But we still need to find a way to get our coolant lines to the front of the car to the radiator, and I've decided the best way to do that is to go through the inside of the car. Now, to make this competition legal and to make it safe, we're going to drill some holes in the car and use bulkhead fittings to pass coolant lines from the car's exterior to the interior. These bulkheads will utilize -20 ORB fittings and allow me to attach an AN hose to each side of it. The goal here is to minimize the number of fittings inside of the vehicle which in turn minimizes the opportunities for a leak or a hose rupture. We'll need 4 bulkhead fittings in total, 2 at the back of the car and 2 in the front. I've got one placed high on the rear firewall where it can exit from the engine heading towards the radiator, and one mounted low headed back towards the water pump. But solving the engine side of this problem is simple. It's getting coolant to the radiator through the front firewall that's the problem. Initially, I was going to pass these bulkhead fittings through the gap that I created in front of our coolant overflow bottle, but it turns out there are a number of reasons that's not doable. On the other hand, there's a ton of real estate behind the coolant bottle before we get to the dash bar of the roll cage. More importantly, I can get access to that space if I cut out the plastic ducting for the original air conditioning system. It's one of the few unused cavities of space left on this car, and we're going to make use of it. Now, I wouldn't count on this to work if we hadn't added those bleed and steam ports to the front end in one of our previous episodes. But because we have them, I'm going to loop our Dash 20 hoses from the rear firewall up the front firewall and back towards our cavity before they pierce it and then head towards the front of the car. On the other side of the panel is another pair of 90-degree fittings that send the coolant to their respective sides of the radiator. From here, it's business as usual, where we'll retain our steam and bleed ports at each side of the car. Bleeding might be tricky, but I think we can pull it off. But with all these hoses running through the car, I decided I needed a way to organize them and at least keep them looking good. So cue that 3D printer once again. I've decided to print a set of Dash 20 hose clamps that will pair off and organize the hoses as they run through the middle of the car. These two are printed from carbon fiber reinforced nylon, which is work rated up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which should play well with the hot coolant lines, considering that they won't really be under any stress. But given that, I did print them at 100% infill, which makes these the strongest parts that I've printed so far. Despite being thin and spindly, I was completely unable to break them by hand, meaning I think they'll hold up just fine. Now I know I'm acting like a dude who just got a 3D printer, because I am one, but I am so stoked on having the ability to just make parts on the fly. I am sure there will be more in this episode and more in plenty of episodes to come, whether they're functional and an end-use part or just for prototyping. This is such a game changer. I should have done this years ago. I'm bummed that I let that other one sit for so long and that I didn't pull the trigger on something like this, because this is just beyond cool. And once you have a functional part, I'd never got to buy something like this again. If I need them, I just click print and I make more. It's incredible. I know I'm stating the obvious to everybody with a 3D printer out there, but if you're on the fence about getting one of these, do it ASAP. This is too sick. I'm going to 3D print an entire car. The clamps worked perfectly and they're a wonderful proof of concept, but I will have to revise them a bit because there is some sheathing we'll have to put over these hoses to be competition legal. But for the time being, as far as plumbing goes, we can cross this off the list. Now let's talk about the seats in the Ferrari. Previously, I had GT pad seatbelts. But given that the rest of the car has more or less gone full race car, I decided I wanted the seat to match. I want as much safety as possible. So I reached out to RaceTech and asked if they'd be interested in partnering up, and luckily they said yes. And as a result, they sent over a Model 4119 full containment seat. As for differences between this seat and my last one, there are some quality of life improvements such as better padding and ventilation in the seat back, but what I'm really interested in are the mounts built within the back of the seat for a seat back anchor. And that might be overkill for what I'm going to be doing with the car, but as said, I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. But installing this RaceTech seat means we've got to design some new seat mounts. Getting the seat into the car is a battle in and of itself. It barely fits through the gap we have in our door bars, but thankfully, it clears by a few millimeters and drops into place. I mentioned in our previous episode that we have changed the driving position of the car by moving the seat towards the middle. And with the RaceTech in place, we can see just how far over it is compared to the original mounts in the floor. It's shifted over by several inches, so we'll need a mount that accounts for this and the additional lean back of the seat compared to its original mounts. I fired up Fusion 360 and designed a mount that works in 2, or technically 3 pieces, 2 side mounts and a base plate that adapts between the car and where the seat wants to be situated. I'll be having SendCutSend cut this out of 3/16 aluminum, and because I was a little bit worried about offsetting the seat, I had my friends on the StanceWorks Discord perform a finite element analysis to confirm that this mount will be more than strong enough. As a result, now we just wait for the seat mounts to arrive. Next on our list, we've got to meet more rules for the Australian World Time Attack Challenge. The rules state that we need a 2-liter catch can, so we'll be swapping out our original Vibrant Performance unit for a bigger one. When I told them I needed one and in a hurry, they were willing to send their updated version over along with all of the plumbing we've used so far. Aside from being bigger, the Gen 3 catch can includes larger ORB AN fittings, a revised mount, and better ventilation geometry. As is probably obvious, the first step in getting the new one installed is to remove the old one. But with the old one removed, we can compare it and the new one side by side, and most importantly, we can compare the mounts. The mount on the new tank comes pre-bent, but thankfully Vibrant kept the exact same hole spacing, so aside from being a bit bigger in length and overall diameter, it will be a straight bolt-in swap to the modified mount we had before. The only hurdle we're going to face is the fact that the new tank runs -12 fittings, and our hose is a -10. We need a fitting that looks like the one on the right, except this one is a male-to-male union, but what you may not know is that ORB fittings are the same as males without the flare. We can convert this right-hand fitting to the one on the left by just chucking it in the lathe and machining it down. So that's exactly what I did. But don't be mistaken, I still have no idea how to use this lathe for anything else other than this. But it comes in handy for times like these, and with a simple operation, our fitting will thread right into place and adapt to our old -10 hose. There's no doubt this was the smallest and most boring job of the episode, but it was an important one that we needed to do to keep us competition legal, and with that, it's an important one that we now cross off the list once again. And now we are on to the final job of the episode. If you remember, a few episodes ago, I showcased some new SKF wheel hubs, and I expressed the need to upgrade to these because the factory units I have on the car currently simply don't hold up to race abuse. But because I re-drilled my car to 5x114.3, I had to send these new hubs across the street to Brett to get machined, and we just got them back. With these installed, we will be ready for true race abuse through the corners, and we'll get wheel speed sensors for a future traction control and ABS upgrade. It's worth noting that while I was working on all the other projects in this episode, it was my buddy John Salerno that tackled the installation of these, and I would not have been able to get this far without his help. And on that same note, there's also my buddy Blake, who's been busy on the computer side of things, tackling the livery design for the Ferrari. We've struggled with some ideas on what direction to take, but he's been narrowing it down slowly but surely, and I think you guys are going to love what he eventually comes up with. Alright, so let's talk about what's left on the car that we need to get done before we can actually drive it. As said, this is the last episode before we actually drive it. I promise I'm going to drive it in the next one. That's my goal. I'll just delay the episode if I have to. As far as chassis goes, there's a handful of things that we need to do. We need to get the correct spring rates on the car. That's probably the biggest one. H&R is sending over some new springs. They'll be a bit stiffer. I'm going to show you guys the process of measuring our motion ratio and then solving for what we want our wheel rate to be versus our spring rate. I want to get the correct springs on the car so it's stiff enough, it's too soft at the moment, and I want to get bump stop packers installed so we don't blow a fender up. Engine-wise, driveline-wise, I think we are good to go. My only note that I have at the moment, I think, going off memory, is I need to put a plug in the top of the transmission. I think everything else should be set. We should be ready to go beat on this thing. Inside the car, obviously, we need to get our seat mount in. We need to get it folded up and installed. I've got to figure out the seat back mount on our seat, and we got to get our seat belts installed. Safety equipment, that really is first and foremost before anything else. I'm not driving the car without a seat belt in it. I got to get our Swaybar shifter set up, and I got to get our cable run because the Swaybar would freely rotate as it is. That's not good while we drive. And I've got to put some sheathing on the coolant lines running through the car so that we are safe in case one springs a leak. If it explodes, if we have some pressure spike, who knows what. I don't want to cover myself in scalding, boiling hot coolant, ideally. Everything else inside should be good to go. We've got all our kill switches set up. under the hood, I think, is pretty good. I don't think there's anything else we need to do. Otherwise, I know that we need to go through and we need to nut and bolt check the entire car. Every single bolt, got to go through. We'll paint the heads as we get them torqued. It's going to take probably a day to go through and do. I've got one steering link to replace. You know, honestly, I think that's about it. I'm sure there's some small stuff here and there, but that covers pretty much everything. I think that's all of our safety equipment. I mean, obviously we know the car drives. I've driven it already, but I want to go for a real drive in it. Ideally, I want to get it out to Streets of Willow for a test day. Next week might be optimistic. It's going to be depending on their schedule. My buddy Will is going to come out, going to help. We're going to go out and do our first shakedown session. That will be within the next, 14 days, presumably. Otherwise, I don't know. I'm probably rambling. I think we're all set. We just need that mount inside the car so that we have our fire extinguisher poles. I think all of our safety equipment's done. Cars, it runs well. Should be set. Suspension-wise, we got to get it aligned. Alignment is important, and I'm rambling at this point. So I'm going to cut this episode off here. If you have made it this far, bless you. I appreciate your support. Wouldn't be able to do this without you guys. And on that note, we are working on the new livery for the car, and with the new livery, we're working on some new merch. We're going to do like a hoodie and a shirt, I think. Maybe not a hoodie, it's heading into summertime. We're going to do a shirt or two, a keychain, and some other small stuff that is all kind of built around the livery for the car. It will all go directly towards supporting the race program for this thing. All of the costs that I've been incurring on getting this thing ready, it's been eating me alive. So think of it as a way for you guys to sponsor this project directly, because I wouldn't be able to do it without you, and I'm here because of you guys. So thank you. It's fun to return something to you guys, to provide something in return for that. Anyways, enough rambling. I'm done. I promise this is it. I'll see you guys next time, next episode. I'll be driving it. See you then.